72,000 people watched in stunned silence as a silver racing Mustang ripped away from the sky and vanished into a plume of smoke. Engines had been screaming for miles. Flags snapped in a bright summer wind. The crowd had come for speed, for spectacle, for the clean, dangerous beauty of men and machines pushing into the margins of performance. For an instant it seemed the war had come back to life on a racetrack. Then the applause died and a different question took hold. What becomes of a fighter when the war that made it is finished? This is the untold story of the P-51 Mustang after World War II. Not the clean, heroic arc of a frontline escort fighter, but the messy, human, and at times tragic second life of a machine meant for total war. It is a story of surplus piles and salvage yards, of pilots who refused to accept obsolescence, of crews who flew the Mustang back into combat under new flags and unfamiliar skies, of clandestine purchases and improvised missions, of reinvention on razor-edge margins, and of a handful of determined people who would go on to rescue the type from extinction and turn it into a living symbol for future generations. If this story is pulling you in, consider subscribing to follow the full journey. There are chapters ahead that trace how a combat-born fighter became a global workhorse, a racing icon, and a museum centerpiece. The end of the war in 1945 did not arrive quietly in aircraft factories. It arrived as a bureaucratic and industrial thunderclap. Contracts canceled, production lines stopped, and tens of thousands of aircraft declared surplus almost overnight. For the United States, victory meant an urgent, brutal demobilization. Men returned home, budgets collapsed, and the country had to decide what to do with an air armory that now seemed far larger than necessary. Across the country, airfields that had been factories for speed were repurposed overnight into scrapyards. Panels were pried off to feed peacetime industries. Fuel was siphoned out. Instruments and radios were stripped and repurposed. Where once squadrons had lined up for combat missions, forlorn rows of parked Mustangs disappeared under tarps, or more often, under the blades of salvage crews. The sight of these fighters, grimy but structurally sound, cut a strange figure in the American imagination. Icons of a recent triumph that had suddenly become part of the surplus economy. The economics were brutal and simple. Aircraft that had cost the government thousands of dollars each to produce during wartime were offered to civilian buyers for a fraction of that sum. The phrase war surplus became shorthand for things sold cheaply and quickly. The piles of aircraft that had been cutting the skies now cut into the budgets of small operators, scrap merchants, and opportunists. For many, the Mustang was simply an aluminum hulk next to 1,000 other items. For a few, pilots, mechanics, dreamers, it was a platform waiting to be repurposed. Into that gap stepped individuals whose attachments to these machines would shape the Mustang's post-war fate. One of them was a small, steady man who would become a recurring figure in the aircraft's afterlife, Ed Maloney. He was not a celebrity aviator, but a preservationist with a stubborn conviction. These machines were not merely scrap. Their stories deserved keeping. Maloney's first impressions, of rusted wings, of plaques lost to time, of men who had once flown these planes telling stories as they pushed the aircraft's wheels over gravel, would become the seed for a movement that argued, in practical and moral terms, for preservation. Not every post-war Mustang found a gentle fate. Some were cannibalized for parts, others found work in strange civilian roles. A handful were converted to executive transports, their guns and ammunition boxes removed, passenger seats jammed into cockpits for a certain breed of wealthy barnstormer. A smaller, riskier cohort entered an altogether different afterlife: air racing. The transition from battlefield to racetrack was as much cultural as mechanical. Air racing in the interwar period had been an elite sport, a carnival of speed. After the war, a new breed of racer emerged. Men who had flown fighters at combat speeds and missed the visceral, concentrated danger of aerial competition. The surplus P-51, with its laminar flow wing, its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and a design that married speed with stability, seemed tailor-made for this new era of racing. But the Mustang, optimized for high-altitude escort and long range, was being asked to do a job it had never been designed for: sustained maximum power runs at low altitude, repeatedly turning through pylon courses a few hundred feet above the ground. Technically, the modifications were focused and relentless. Every pound counted. Guns, ammunition, armor panels, all were stripped. Radiators and oil coolers were sometimes reshaped or relocated to reduce drag. Cowlings were smoothed. Propellers with different pitch characteristics were fitted. Engines were tuned to higher manifold pressures and higher RPMs, often at the cost of reliability. Fuel mixtures were enriched and specialized high-octane blends introduced to extract extra power from the Merlin. Even subtle changes in aerodynamics, sealing panel gaps, filing small protuberances, could yield noticeable speed gains. The men and women who took Mustangs to the racetrack did so with a blend of engineering audacity and personal daring. Jackie Cochran, one of the most prominent aviation figures of her time, became a visible patron of racing Mustangs. Her name lent the sport a level of prestige and attention. Veterans such as Cook Cleland and a cadre of ex-military pilots adapted their combat skills to the pylon course, learning that winning at low altitude required not just speed but discipline and a precise understanding of the machine's altered flight envelope. Those lessons were hard. The 1949 Thompson Trophy race at Cleveland, the race where the Mustang's post-war promise first collided sharply with its practical limitations, provides a stark tableau. The event drew tens of thousands. The heat shimmered over the lake. The track carved a loop close to the grass where families picnicked. Bill Odom, a pilot with a record for daring maneuvers in the post-war racing scene, took off in a highly modified Mustang, lightened, tuned, and pushed close to the edge. Contemporary reports indicate that the aircraft suffered catastrophic failure during a high-speed pass. The machine broke apart in flight, the wreckage tumbling into a field. Investigations afterward were careful and contested. Race organizers, mechanics, and contemporaneous news accounts floated multiple, sometimes competing explanations. Some pointed to structural fatigue, arguing that modifications and repeated overstressing had weakened critical components. Others cited pilot technique and the unforgiving maneuvers demanded by pylon racing. Still others suggested that mechanical failure, a propeller detachment or engine seizure, might have triggered the breakup. There was and remains no single universally accepted cause. What happened in Cleveland produced immediate and reverberating consequences. Public reaction to an accident on that scale, witnessed by so many, was a sobering counterpoint to the daredevilry that had animated the sport. Organizers faced political and social pressure. Insurers tightened coverage. Race committees reconsidered the wisdom of encouraging heavily modified surplus military aircraft to participate. For many pilots and mechanics, the Cleveland crash illuminated a painful truth. The Mustang could be pushed beyond its design margins when re-engineered for racing, and the safety protocols and structural histories required to do so safely were still being developed. The crash did not end air racing, but it changed its tenor and forced a period of self-examination within the racing community. While racing and civilian modifications occupied one strand of the Mustang's post-war life, another strand was developing quietly and dangerously in geopolitics and in provisional air forces around the globe. When surplus American aircraft became available, small nations and newly formed air arms saw in them a way to establish or expand aerial capability quickly and cheaply. The Mustang turned up under many flags, sometimes modified for counterinsurgency, sometimes pressed into reconnaissance, sometimes serving as a stopgap until jets could be procured. The pattern was consistent. Where budget or urgency constrained a country's procurement, the P-51's combination of range, speed, and ruggedness made it attractive. The handling of these exports and transfers was uneven. Some aircraft were sold through official surplus channels under inter-American or other transfer programs. Others exchanged hands through intermediary dealers, private buyers, or, in a few instances, clandestine networks. In some cases, record-keeping was sparse. Provenance would later become a critical issue for restorers seeking to verify an airframe's history. What is clear is that the Mustang's wings, once the emblem of American air power over Europe and the Pacific, now cast shadows over a dozen widely different airspaces, from the deserts of the Middle East to the jungles of Southeast Asia. Back in the United States, not everyone accepted the scrap heap destiny for these machines. A nascent community of enthusiasts, restorers, and museums began to coherently argue that the Mustang's significance exceeded its immediate utility. Ed Maloney's early efforts illustrate how salvage became stewardship. He collected wrecks and orphaned airframes, often at personal cost, and attempted pragmatic restorations, structural repairs, replacement of missing panels, sourcing of period components. His focus was not museum display alone, but revival, returning the aircraft to the living tradition of flight when possible. His work helped nurture the idea that historical machines deserved active preservation rather than passive static display. For a type like the P-51, that meant recovering aircraft from boneyards, painstaking metallurgical repairs, and in many cases the resurrection of lost technical knowledge about maintenance of the Merlin engine and its complex systems. Restoration in the post-war decades was a patient, meticulous craft. Often, restorers encountered puzzling mismatches of serial numbers and parts, evidence of wartime improvisation or post-war cannibalization. The Merlin engine itself, a masterful product of British engineering fitted to an American airframe, presented a particular challenge. Restorers had to understand both its mechanical rhythm and the hydraulic, cooling, and fuel systems that kept it alive. It was not simply a matter of bolting old parts together. The Mustang's systems demanded both historical research and modern ingenuity to operate safely. This technical labor existed alongside a growing cultural reevaluation of the Mustang. Film and television increasingly looked to the aircraft when they needed a credible stand-in for the era's aerial combat. Air shows, too, became a stage on which the Mustang's narrative could be performed. The roar of a Merlin at low altitude, the gleaming lines traced across blue sky, these became the images that re-embedded the P-51 in popular memory. At the same time, a small but passionate community argued that the Mustang's best place was in motion, not merely behind glass. They wanted to keep it flying, not because it could compete with jets, but because its presence in the air stitched generations together. Veterans who had flown these planes, the next generation who would see them in museums and at shows, and technicians who preserved lost skills. The early post-war years also illuminated a critical tension that would shape the Mustang's later uses: the difference between obsolescence in headline terms and operational utility in practice. In public and in doctrine, the jet age arrived with rhetorical finality. Propeller fighters, many argued, belonged to another epoch. But on runways and in budget lines, practicality often trumped doctrine. Jets demanded new support systems, infrastructure, and a more complicated logistics tale. For many air forces confronted with limited budgets or immediate threats, a surplus piston fighter represented a practical, if imperfect, solution. A technical aside helps to make this tension concrete. The Rolls-Royce Merlin installed in the P-51 relied on a liquid cooling system for engine temperature control. Unlike air-cooled radial engines that could sustain more direct small arms damage and continue to function, a liquid-cooled engine depended on a network of radiators and coolant piping. A punctured radiator could rapidly lead to overheating and engine seizure. Designers placed radiators to minimize drag and to contribute to the Mustang's exceptional aerodynamics. But that placement, and the complexity of the cooling plumbing, introduced an operational vulnerability. In low-altitude ground attack scenarios, where small arms and anti-aircraft fire came up at close ranges, this trait produced a real and often deadly risk. The vulnerability did not make the Mustang useless. It simply meant that mission planners and pilots had to understand the price of using the aircraft in roles it had not originally been designed for. That calculus, speed, range, and loiter time against increased susceptibility to ground fire, would later be written in the pilot's reports and squadron casualty lists from Korea and other hot conflicts. At the same time, the same features that posed risks also made the Mustang valuable. The aircraft could carry a heavy ordnance load for a piston fighter, it had exceptional range, and it could operate from rougher fields than early jets. These qualities made it an attractive option for ground attack, close support, and reconnaissance in theaters, where logistical simplicity and endurance mattered. The drama, then, is not a simple story of the obsolescent replaced by the new. It is a recurring negotiation between doctrine and need, between the promises of aerodynamic modernity and the practicalities of limited budgets and urgent conflicts. The mustard seed beginnings of the preservation movement and the startling spectacle of air racing were not isolated phenomena. They were part of a broader circulation. Mustangs moved from American fields to foreign air forces, to civilian owners, and into the hands of entrepreneurs who saw profit in repair, resell, or repurpose. Along the way, provenance became a complex puzzle. Serial numbers, service records, and modification logs were sometimes incomplete or missing. Restorers learned to read an aircraft as a palimpsest. Layers of paint, rivet patterns, and replaced fittings all told stories about the plane's uses and misuses. Tracing an aircraft's history meant chasing down paperwork across continents, translating logs, and sometimes accepting uncertainties that archival silence could not resolve. The human element threaded through all of these mechanical practices. Mechanics who had worked on Mustangs during the war now found work in civilian aviation, film productions, or restorations. Pilots who had flown Mustang missions overseas returned with knowledge that made them uniquely suited to the aircraft's peacetime roles. They could extract a few extra miles of range from a worn fuel tank. They could coax an unreliable hydraulic pump back to life. And they carried a felt loyalty to the machines that had carried them through hazard. For many veterans, seeing a Mustang resurrected and flown again was not simple nostalgia. It was a form of recognition that their experiences mattered. The post-war period was also one of legal and policy negotiation. How and to whom surplus aircraft could be sold involved a tangle of military policy, export controls, and diplomatic calculation. Some governments were cautious, seeking to retain control over where advanced aircraft might end up. Others welcomed the immediate capability that surplus can provide. Records show a mixture of official transfers and private sales, and in the murkier corners of Cold War geopolitics, the movement of aircraft sometimes occurred through intermediaries and shadowed transactions. In the absence of complete public records, historians and restorers have had to reconstruct chains of custody from fragments of documentation and oral history, where only a single source exists for a story, an isolated memoir or a contemporary newspaper column. Caution is essential. Such accounts can illuminate but cannot always stand as confirmed fact. Even as Mustangs made this slow diaspora, the cultural narrative around them changed. The aircraft became symbols of adaptability, designed to contest the Luftwaffe. They would fly low over battlefields in Asia, dive for film cameras over California, and roar past pylons at Reno. The Mustang's design, once optimized for a very specific wartime role, showed a surprising elasticity. That adaptability, however, came with trade-offs. When used in roles for which it was not intended, the Mustang carried risks that were both mechanical and human. By the late 1940s, the Mustang's post-war fate had settled into several overlapping tracks. A limited number entered legitimate civilian service in transport or demonstration roles. A smaller, visible contingent was modified for racing, subject to both triumph and catastrophe, and a far larger contingent migrated overseas, serving as the backbone of emerging air forces or as stopgap equipment in crises that would flare in theaters far removed from the European battlefields where the type had first made its name. Our story now pauses at a hinge. The Cleveland crash and the crowded scrapyards of 1945 exposed two faces of the Mustang's post-war life: spectacle and disposability. Behind both lay deeper currents, the political realities that funneled surplus aircraft to foreign fields, the emergent debates about preservation versus pragmatism, and the technical challenges that would determine whether the Mustang could safely be adapted to new missions. The aircraft's trajectory from racetrack ruin to restoration bench would be shaped by a handful of people willing to shoulder the cost, and by the geopolitics that would soon drag older machines back into active combat. What followed next, where Mustangs would again taste real combat under new flags, where their technical vulnerabilities would be tested against fresh forms of anti-aircraft fire, and where preservationists would wage a quiet counter-campaign against the scrapmen, is a second chapter that begins with the outbreak of a new war on the Korean Peninsula. In that conflict, doctrine and necessity would collide, and the Mustang's renewed role would force hard choices for pilots, planners, and nations. The call to Korea arrived like an old truth returned. Where doctrine had declared propeller fighters obsolete, the map of conflict and the limits of supply made a different argument. When you needed persistence over a battlefield, a long loiter time, and the ability to base on rough strips the P-51 still answered. As the peninsula ignited, Mustangs were pressed back into service, this time designated F-51 by the United States Air Force, and sent into missions their designers had not primarily envisioned. Close air support, interdiction, and armed reconnaissance over terrain thick with small arms and anti-aircraft fire. On the morning of their redeployment, the Mustangs felt both familiar and foreign to the men who climbed into them. The Merlin engine's low, powerful rumble was as comforting as a ritual. The airframe's response, tight, responsive, reminded pilots of their old high-altitude work. Yet the mission set had shifted. High-altitude escort gave way to slow descents, to strafing runs under a sky where the enemy did not fight fair at altitude, but waited for the aircraft as it bled speed in the lower levels. Pilots who had mastered formation tactics and long-range sweeps found themselves calculating exposure times, egress vectors, and the likely angles of small arms fire. Tactical reports from the period reveal a steady, pragmatic calculus. Mustangs were valued for their fuel capacity, endurance, and ability to carry bombs and rockets in addition to their machine guns. They could operate from forward fields that jets could not reach without robust logistical support. That combination allowed commanders to deliver close air support to embattled ground units in a theater where the availability of aircraft at the right time and place could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Yet the very features that made the Mustang effective also made it vulnerable. A succinct technical note helps explain why. The Merlin's liquid cooling system, with its network of radiators, intercoolers, and plumbing arranged to reduce drag and improve high-speed performance, created a single point of failure in low-altitude combat. Small-caliber rounds that might glance off an air-cooled radial could, against the Mustang, puncture a radiator or coolant line. The result was quick: overheated cylinders, seizing engines, and forced glides toward flat fields. Ground fire also could disable oil coolers or hydraulic lines, degrading engine output or control authority. In short, the Mustang traded some battlefield toughness for performance, and in Korea, that trade manifested in lives and damaged machines. This reality shows up in mission narratives. Pilots describe the instant a coolant temperature gauge began to spike, the immediate attempts to feather power, the grim judgment whether to push on to the target or seek a field. At times, those choices turned on the proximity of friendly territory, on the pilot's knowledge of local terrain, and on the aircrew's confidence that they could nurse a damaged Merlin back to base. These were not abstract risks. They were routine calculations that turned ordinary missions into high-stakes decisions. Despite losses, Mustangs carried out a large number of sorties where their endurance and weapons load made them uniquely practical. They struck supply lines, attacked concentrations of enemy personnel, and provided immediate support where jet assets were unavailable or unsuited. Their presence allowed ground commanders a tempo of close air support that would have been difficult to achieve with the fewer, more maintenance-intensive jets of the era. In this sense, the Mustang's post-war life was paradoxical, declared technologically outmoded by the rhetoric of the jet age, yet repeatedly re-enlisted by the practical needs of ground war. The human toll of that re-enlistment was not negligible. Mustangs in Korea sustained many combat losses, some through catastrophic structural failures after sustained stress, some through severe battle damage, and some through accidents on improvised airstrips. Official records and squadron histories provide fragmented but revealing pictures of these losses. Where they are incomplete, reporting indicates that attrition was significant enough to color the way squadrons trained and operated. Commanders instituted new tactics: higher ingress speeds at low level when possible, increased use of suppressive fire from accompanying aircraft, and careful selection of targets to minimize sustained exposure. For pilots, each mission demanded a blend of courage and conservative judgment. At a micro level, the Mustang's experiences in Korea also pushed crews to innovate. Maintenance teams adapted cooling solutions, experimented with quick repair kits for radiators and oil lines, and devised field expedients that stretched damaged aircraft enough to return them to depot for proper repair. The knowledge gained in that environment, what could be patched quickly, what required component replacement, how to detect early signs of stress in airframes, later proved invaluable to restorers and historians trying to understand the aircraft's service life. In this way, The Mustang's wartime and post-war careers were not discrete episodes, but a continuous flow of technical knowledge, improvised fixes, and the slow accumulation of operational wisdom. While Mustangs fought again under the American flag, the aircraft's reach was already transnational. Surplus sales, diplomatic transfers, and private brokers had placed Mustangs in the inventories of dozens of countries, each adopting them to local conditions and needs. Some air forces used Mustangs as a stopgap until they could procure jets. Others adapted them into roles that fit regional conflicts and budgets. The aircraft's longevity after World War II is best understood as a global diffusion, a scattering of a design optimized in one era into a dozen different political and geophysical environments. One striking pattern appeared in the Middle East. Newly established air forces and security services saw in the Mustang an opportunity to project power quickly. Israel became an especially notable case. Facing existential threats and constrained procurement channels, Israeli forces and sympathetic intermediaries arranged for the acquisition of Mustangs through a mixture of official and unofficial pathways. The mechanics of these transfers, brokered purchases, careful repapering, and logistical ingenuity are complex, and in several cases remain partially indefinito in the archival record. What is clear is that once in Israeli hands, Mustangs were adapted for missions that went beyond simple patrol or air defense. One often told episode involves an operation to sever enemy communications lines in the Sinai. Low-level sorties cutting telephone and telegraph wires, often flown at dawn or dusk to minimize detection. Contemporary reporting and later histories describe these missions as audacious and technically creative. They demanded precise flying at low altitude and coordination with ground forces. Where direct documentary proof is limited, historians mark such accounts as based on reports and oral histories rather than undisputed official records. Sweden offers another instructive variation. Neutral in the great powers' conflicts, Swedish authorities nevertheless sought intelligence on air movements along their borders. Mustangs acquired for mapping and reconnaissance missions, sometimes referred to in Swedish service by the J-26 designation, performed coastal surveillance and photography flights near Soviet airspace, operating under rules shaped by caution and the desire to avoid provocation. These flights required sophisticated navigation and photography equipment additions. Aircraft were modified to carry cameras in place of some armament and to extend endurance for long patrols. The secrecy around these operations, born of Cold War prudence, left gaps in the public record, and scholars often rely on declassified fragments and veteran testimony to reconstruct what occurred. In Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Mustangs became tools of internal security as well as national defense. The Philippines and Indonesia used their Mustangs in anti-insurgency roles, often in rugged terrain where the aircraft's range and ability to operate from austere strips were critically valuable. In Indonesia, press reports and some historical accounts attribute at least one air-to-air victory to pilots flying Mustangs. Captain Ignatius Duanto is referenced in some sources in this context, though, as with several international incidents, documenting a definitive kill count across disparate archives is challenging. Here, too, the careful historian must balance respect for oral history and contemporary reporting with the limits of surviving documentation. Central America provides perhaps the most dramatic late chapter of the Mustang's combat life. In 1969, a brief but intense conflict erupted between neighboring countries, often referred to in English as the Soccer War. It was in this environment, more than 2 decades after the aircraft's first combat, that Mustangs once again engaged in air combat against other piston-powered airplanes. Reports from the period describe dogfights where leaded gasoline and sheer pilot skill mattered more than the latest aerodynamic refinement. These engagements are often cited as the last significant piston-propeller aerial dogfights between sovereign states. They highlight a stark historical irony. While the jet age had transformed air warfare on the grand scale, in certain theaters and under certain political constraints, the older technology remained decisive. The human dimension of these episodes is acute. Combatants on both sides often flew machines that they had to maintain under primitive conditions, often scavenging parts and munitions from whatever sources were available. Pilots conducted missions with an intimate, gritty awareness of fragility. A hit to a coolant system could be fatal. A miscalculation of fuel could strand an aircraft over hostile territory. Where records permit, historians treat losses and victories with careful restraint, avoiding sensationalized death tolls and acknowledging the limits of available documentation. In parallel to the Mustang's active service around the globe, another post-war narrative gathered momentum back in the United States and in parts of Europe. The rescue of the type from oblivion through dedicated preservation, and in many cases, the restoration of airworthy examples. The story of this movement is a study in conviction, technical skill, and the conversion of private passion into public heritage. Ed Maloney's work stands at the center of this effort. As one of the earliest to recognize that entire airframes were being lost to scrap, he mobilized resources to rescue dozens of planes, among them Mustangs, from disposal piles and abandoned fields. Maloney's approach combined what might be called an archivist's patience with a mechanic's practicality. He documented serial numbers, salvaged serviceable parts, and worked with volunteers to reassemble machines that industry had deemed worthless. His insistence that airplanes should fly if they could be made airworthy was, at the time, an argument against prevailing norms, which treated historical artifacts as static displays. He argued for the experiential value of flight, that seeing and hearing a Merlin revived at air shows could connect generations in a way that photographs alone could not. Restoration is, at its heart, both an art and a science. The process of returning a Mustang to airworthiness requires meticulous attention to structural detail, inspection and repair of spars and longerons, replacement of corroded skin panels, and the recreation of missing components when originals are not available. Metal fatigue becomes a central concern. Restorers use non-destructive testing, ultrasonic inspection, dye-penetrant checks, to locate hairline cracks. Where panels are beyond repair, craftsmen fabricate new skins, closely matching original aluminum gauges and rivet patterns to maintain structural integrity and period appearance. Systems are overhauled, fuel tanks are sealed and pressure tested, hydraulic lines are replaced, and modern certified avionics may be integrated sympathetically to preserve cockpit authenticity while meeting contemporary airworthiness standards. The Merlin engine itself often demands the most care. Restorers must source correct crankshafts, service or rebuild superchargers, recondition carburetors or fuel injection components, and ensure that cooling systems are free of obstruction and corrosion. Beyond the mechanical labor, restorers confront legal and archival problems. Provenance must be established, serial numbers checked against government disposal lists, squadron histories cross-referenced, and rumors separated from paperwork. Often, a Mustang will present evidence of multiple lives, repaired wingtips from one theater, an instrument panel from another, paint layers revealing at least 3 distinct liveries. Each change tells a story, and careful restoration respects that palimpsest rather than erasing it. Among the most storied restorations is Sierra Sioux II, a Mustang whose careful rebuilding and performance runs helped anchor the narrative that a well-restored Mustang could be both historically faithful and aerobatically spectacular. Sierra Sioux II's registry in racing and record attempts demonstrated another truth. In the hands of committed pilots and engineers, the Mustang retained an extraordinary performance envelope when properly maintained and flown within understood limits. The aircraft's speed runs and record flights reminded the public that the design's aerodynamic efficiency, when married to a properly tuned Merlin, remained exceptional. The reappearance of Mustangs in the post-war air racing world embodied both continuity and change. The Cleveland crash of 1949 had imposed hard lessons. Racetracks and organizers increasingly sought clearer regulatory frameworks to balance spectacle and safety. As racing relocated to new venues and disciplines, most famously the Reno Air Races, which became a magnet for warbird competition, participants began to professionalize the engineering of racer Mustangs. Where early racers sometimes leaned on improvisation, later teams invested in rigorous structural assessments, reinforced fittings, and carefully engineered engine modifications aimed at improving reliability under sustained high power. The modifications themselves range from conservative to extreme, reflecting differing philosophies about risk and reward. Conservative approaches focused on weight reduction, aerodynamic cleanups, and careful engine tuning within safe boost pressures. More radical builds pushed supercharger and manifold modifications, advanced fuels, and extreme propeller selections to extract every last knot of speed. The difference between a quick, controlled flight and a catastrophic structural failure could hinge on a small, overlooked stress riser or a repeated overstress cycle accumulated over multiple high-G pulls. The racing community's increasing emphasis on engineering oversight, load testing, and formal inspection protocols reduced, but could not eliminate, the inherent risks of racing heavily modified warbirds. This period also saw a growing professionalism among pilots, exemplified by families such as the Hintons, and by pilots like Steve Hinton, whose careers bridged the worlds of competition, restoration, and public demonstration. These individuals and families developed deep intergenerational knowledge of the Mustang, how to service Merlins, how to interpret subtle in-flight vibrations, and how to prepare an aircraft for a high-stress race pass. Their expertise, passed from mechanic to pilot and across decades, became a crucial repository of tacit knowledge that museums and restoration shops now rely upon. The economics of Mustang ownership and restoration changed dramatically from the 1940s. Where a surplus airframe in the immediate post-war period could be had for a price that reflected scrap value, the modern market treats airworthy Mustangs as both rare artifacts and high-performance machines. The capital required to make a Mustang airworthy, including airframe work, engine rebuild, avionics upgrade, certification, and hangarage, became substantial. This shift in value turned restorations into investments often sustained through sponsorship, museum patronage, or the personal resources of enthusiasts. For museums, the decision to keep a Mustang flying versus placing it on static display involved an assessment of cost, public engagement potential, and the responsibility of training qualified pilots and mechanics to maintain an operational airframe. The preservation movement also engaged with the ethical question of authenticity. How much modernization is acceptable in the name of safety? When is a replacement part a necessary concession, and when does it alter the object's historical meaning? These debates animated the community, leading many restorers to adopt transparent practices, documenting every substitution, marking non-period components, and making provenance information publicly accessible. This ethic of openness bolstered both scholarly research and public trust. The Mustang's cinematic and cultural presence further fueled interest in preservation. Films and documentaries used Mustangs for aerial sequences that needed authenticity. Air shows provided visceral experiences that photos could not replicate. When a Merlin-powered Mustang screamed past a crowd at 50 feet, the sound carried a complicated message: remembrance, engineering marvel, and the sensory thrill of a machine that had lived through the most intense aerial combat of the 20th century. Restoration and preservation did more than maintain airframes. They kept alive communities. Workshops became meeting places where retired mechanics taught apprentices, where veterans told flight stories that connected personal memory with physical objects, and where engineers documented regionally specific maintenance practices. The Mustang's survival relied on this social network as much as on rivets and spare parts. As the Mustang's restored numbers grew, so did the regulatory and cultural frameworks around flying rare warbirds. Insurance companies required detailed maintenance logs and pilot qualifications. Airshow organizers adopted stricter safety standards. Some mothballed the highest-risk demonstration maneuvers while highlighting the aircraft's historical significance through narrated flybys and formation displays. The public saw these planes not just as machines of war but as artifacts that could be experienced, heard, smelled, and felt. Across oceans, Mustangs in foreign nations experienced parallel destinies. Some airframes that had served in early post-war conflicts later entered the hands of collectors or museums in Europe and the Americas. Others lingered in remote hangars, their histories partly forgotten until an interested historian or restorer pieced together ownership paper traces and serial numbers. For restorers chasing provenance, a single stamped plate or logbook entry could open a cascade of archival leads, squadron rosters, maintenance manifest entries, and photographic contacts that helped reassemble an aircraft's biography. Where such trails ended, restorers acknowledged uncertainty, marking stories as probable or indefinito when conclusive documentation lacked. By the late 20th century, the Mustang had achieved a cultural afterlife that its original designers could scarcely have imagined. It appeared in Hollywood films as a stand-in for aerial combat, It flew in memorial formations at national ceremonies. It featured in documentaries recounting the arc of air power in the 20th century. For younger generations attending air shows, a Mustang's sight and sound became a tactile lesson in history, connecting them to veterans whose stories might otherwise remain abstract. The aircraft's visual elegance, its fuselage lines, its distinctive canopy, the Merlin's deep exhaust note, helped make it an icon of a bygone era, while the hard realities of its wartime and post-war service anchored that icon in human consequence. Even as the Mustang enjoyed rehabilitation in the public imagination, historians kept probing its less glamorous roles. The aircraft's use in covert and semi-covert operations, sometimes facilitated by private operators and intermediaries, raised questions about the intersection of surplus policy, diplomacy, and clandestine procurement. Where documentation allowed, historians described transfers through official surplus programs, inter-American channels, and diplomatic sales. In other cases, transfers involved brokers, private dealers, and intermediary companies that obscured ownership for political reasons. The degree to which such procurement pathways were clandestine varied, and the historian's responsibility is to present documented facts while marking gaps and uncertainties with care. Through all these chapters runs a moral reflection about reuse. The Mustang's post-war life is not a single hero's arc, but a mosaic, junked and rebuilt, raced and shot down, treasured and forgotten. Its history raises questions about how societies value military artifacts, how choice and necessity shape the tools of war into tools of peace or spectacle, and how memory is preserved or lost. The ethical challenge for preservationists has been to honor the lives and sacrifices of those connected to these machines without glamorizing violence. This balance, respectful, sober, and curious, has guided much of the restoration and public presentation work. The documentary thread that began with the Cleveland crash comes full circle in late 20th and early 21st century air shows, where restored Mustangs fly not as instruments of competition with jets, but as embodiments of continuity. They testify to a resilient design and to the people who committed themselves to keeping that design alive. Pilots who fly restored Mustangs today are stewards more than owners. They must respect maintenance calendars, honor original systems when possible, and balance public desire for dramatic displays with safety imperatives. Alongside individual restorations, institutions like Planes of Fame, whose work Ed Maloney helped to define, played a pivotal role in building organizational models for aircraft preservation. Museums institutionalized practices, long-term conservation plans, the training of specialized mechanics, and partnerships with regulators to certify airworthiness. They also served as educational hubs, curating narratives that contextualize the Mustang's military function, post-war adaptations, and the human stories linked to each airframe. The racing renaissance, too, evolved into a more regulated, engineering-driven enterprise. Organizations overseeing warbird racing emphasized structural testing, fatigue life documentation, and rigorous pre-flight inspections. Where early races operated on a high-risk improvisational basis, later events involved formal engineering oversight, often led by teams with backgrounds in aerospace engineering and high-performance aviation maintenance. These practices preserved the thrill of competition while reducing avoidable risks. Modern restorers and pilots also pursued ambitious performance projects. Pilots like Doug Matthews, whose record flights and high-speed runs became part of the Mustang's modern mythology, demonstrated that with careful engineering and respect for structural limits, the Mustang could still set speed marks that astonished audiences. Such projects were not merely vanity endeavors. They contributed to the technical knowledge base about cooling efficiencies, propeller dynamics, and safe engine tuning that benefited the broader community of owners and operators. The Mustang's narrative also intersects with contemporary debates about cultural heritage and the politics of memorialization. Where should a warplane be displayed, and how should its history be told? Exhibitions that pair Mustangs with oral histories from veterans, archival footage, and critical reflection on the context of conflict offer one model, one that situates the aircraft within broader historical processes rather than celebrating technology for its own sake. Many museums now adopt interpretive approaches that foreground both technical ingenuity and human cost, presenting the Mustang as an object that prompts questions rather than easy answers. As the Mustang continued to appear at air shows and in film, its international story remained unfinished. Planes that served in the Philippines, Indonesia, Sweden, Israel, and Central America remained objects of ongoing archival work. Restorers in different countries developed convergent techniques, but they also adapted local solutions to problems such as corrosion in tropical climates or the scarcity of specific parts. International cooperation, parts exchanges, technical manuals translation, and joint restorations became a practical necessity. Heritage professionals began to treat the Mustang not as a national artifact, but as a shared international legacy reflecting 20th century geopolitics. The aircraft's last combat episodes, especially those in Central America in 1969, remain a sobering capstone to the Mustang's martial career. They remind us that technology persists in unexpected corners. Where budgets are constrained and conflicts ignite, older systems can reemerge with lethal effectiveness. At the same time, the Mustang's preservation and public display demonstrate a different kind of persistence, of collective memory, technical skills, and the social networks that keep complex machinery operable and meaningful across generations. In the final reckoning, the P-51's post-World War II life resists simple narratives. It is neither a tale of inevitable decline nor an uncomplicated triumph of restoration. It is a layered story of reuse and reinvention, of aircraft pressed back into combat in Korea, adapted by nations with diverse needs, converted into racers that both thrilled and killed, and rescued by preservationists who saw in their aluminum skins and Merlin engines a worth that transcended scrap value. The Mustang's second life is a mirror for the ways societies reuse, remember, and sometimes romanticize the instruments of war. We close with the image that opened this story. A silver Mustang tearing across a summer sky, engines pushed to the limit, a crowd holding its breath. That image is complicated now. It recalls the thrill of speed and the tragedy of a metal frame failing under stresses it was not designed to endure. It also recalls rows of aircraft on peacetime fields, some sold for pocket change, others rescued with painstaking labor. Above all, it recalls people, pilots making split-second choices over hostile ground, mechanics who learned the Merlin's temperament, preservationists who bought rusted tangles of metal to save a piece of history, and families who flew to air shows to hear a Merlin sing. The Mustang story after World War II is not an ending, but a continuing conversation about technology, memory, and stewardship. It asks how we balance the desire for living history with the obligation to remember the costs of conflict. It asks how nations and communities might turn instruments of war into artifacts of learning, not of celebration for their destructive power, but of respect for the lives entwined with them. If the history of the Mustang's many second acts leaves a question ringing, it is this. What responsibility do we bear toward machines that have outlived their original purposes, but still command our attention and effort? The restorers, pilots, and historians who have kept Mustangs flying suggest an answer. One rooted in care, documentation, and sober interpretation. By preserving these aircraft and telling their full stories, the triumphs, the tragedies, and the mundane work of maintenance, we ensure that they remain tools for education rather than objects of unexamined nostalgia. Share with us a Mustang memory, or tell us which chapter of this plane's life moved you most. If you want to support efforts to preserve aviation heritage, links to museums and restoration groups appear in the description below. Consider them as ways to keep the story airborne for the next generation.